I found it fascinating how people from the past seem to make predictions that were so orientated around the environment surrounding themselves, even with the predictions that they got correct. Take, for example, these predictions of the 21st century by 19th century French artists. One prediction they made was that people would communicate by physically seeing each other across large distances with projectors, which is partially correct with that technology existing with FaceTime, for example, but they were wrong about the projectors. Nothing is wrong with these incorrect predictions of the future. There's a certain charm to them, a certain novelty if the events depicted in these predictions did come true. You might see the resemblance between these pieces of art and steampunk, a subgenre of sci-fi where electrical power was never invented, and instead all technology is powered via steam. Steampunk was coined as a term many years after the invention and obsolescence of steam energy. So steampunk isn't a prediction of the future, but more instead a glimpse into an alternative version of history. Though steampunk isn't the only genre in which this aspect is used. Art like this that celebrates this kind of incorrectness of future predictions is called Retrofuturism. Though there's so much media out there that uses Retrofuturism that I could be here all day. For the sake of your time and your sanity, I'll just be focusing on Retrofuturism in games. I find it interesting that even with games that choose to base themselves on the same time period, they can differ greatly depending on what kind of story they want to tell. For example, TF2 and the Fallout series are both based on the same 1950s/Cold War inspired setting, but both take drastically different directions. TF2 takes things in a stylized and comedic direction, while Fallout takes place in a post-apocalyptic setting taking place in the future. They both fit their respective universes. TF2's visual style is perfect not only for design based on clean silhouette and colors, but since it's based on 1950s sci-fi, it lets you get away with making robots or weapons that don't make mechanical sense. Why is Soldier loading 4 rockets into his rocket launcher one after the other through the front of his launcher? How do all the parts for a level 3 sentry suddenly emerge out of a space that used to be a level 1 sentry? You don't need to question it. It's just as plausible as those cool geometric robot designs from the 1950s. The artist didn't care whether it made sense or not. It looked cool, and that's all that mattered. As for Fallout, the grittier setting fits a post-apocalyptic United States, and the theme that
War never changes.
Interestingly, Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas all have weapons that you can use that aren't tied to the setting that inspired the series. The Marksman Carbine and Assault Carbine are both AR-15 inspired rifles that wouldn't exist until around the 70s. This suggests that even though Fallout's world has stagnated into a 1950s vision of the future in 2077, they would still develop weaponry that is convergent to our own history with these weapons. Hell, even in the same series, it can't be kept consistent, since Bethesda became the new developer for Fallout games in 2007. They never included any weapons that would hint at more modern weaponry in newer games. Instead, they decided to go back in time and use World War I or American Civil War era weapons as inspiration for their fictional weapons, or make improvised weapons, which a lot of people did not like, but let's not get into that. Outside of these two games, there are other games that even like to embrace retrofuturism as parody. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. In its promotional material, it says it is 2007. It is the future, even though the game came out in 2013. A lot like the rest of the humor of the game likes to be meta and crack jokes at its own identity.
I fucking hate tutorials.
The whole art style of the game is based on the aesthetic of 80s neon sci-fi and 80s media in general. There are references to a bunch of pop culture media from the time, like The Terminator, RoboCop, Predator, you name it. It reminded me of how Evangelion had giant mechs, holograms, and huge underground facilities, You would think that this takes place maybe 100 years after the present from the creator's perspective, but no, the story takes place in 2015, only 20 years after the show was first aired. It's funny to imagine these years, especially more recent ones, that have been predicted to have insanely advanced technology, when we know in hindsight that they don't. From what I've described, you may think that retrofuturism is only a surface level or a thematic coat of paint over art, but there are some games that I think can only be told with retrofuturism. Bioshock Infinite was based on the 1893 World Fair in Chicago, where a temporary city was constructed to show the ideal aspects of the United States. It was a beautiful and idealized version of the US on the surface, but there was actually a serial killer running around at the fair. Infinite took this idea, as well as elements from the Gilded Age several decades after this fair, and turned it into the floating city of Columbia. Already from the first few minutes of the game, it gave a first impression of a beautiful city.
10,000 feet. 15,000 feet. Hallelujah.
But as you continued playing the game, there would be scenes that you would witness that would make you realize that the city was not as perfect as you thought during the beginning of the game. Just like during the Gilded Age, the US had seen immense amounts of prosperity on the surface, but once you looked deep into it, there was also inequality and discrimination that was overlooked. Bioshock Infinite's world is so entrenched in the past that if the story took place in modern times or the future, the game would not make as much sense for the world and what kind of story they're trying to tell, and I think it wouldn't be as impactful. Why not tell a story of American exceptionalism based on an event in history that is an example of American exceptionalism? So, retrofuturism is used a lot more in media than people think it is, and it brings out a cool new aesthetic as well as becoming a new avenue for storytelling. There's multiple ways of creating a world based on the same era of retrofuturism, and to me, it seems to bring out something fresh by imagining yourself from the perspective of others in the past. There aren't that many games based on retrofuturism, and I wish there was. Those are my thoughts on retrofuturism, and I hope someone was inspired by what I've described. If you like the video, drop a like or a subscribe. If you want to support me more directly, I have a Patreon in the description, and once you join my Patreon, you'll be able to see videos early and vote in polls in which kind of videos you want to see next. See ya.